Hello everyone, so I am back now with part 2, the discourse analysis. This is the second part of your assignment requirements for assignment 2, where you're going to be looking, not counting and coding so much the content of your media articles, but trying to understand the larger social and political context and the purposes for the way in which people use particular words, particular images, because it's not always, well, it's never innocently placed there. There's always some sort of motive, even if the person placing the image isn't consciously aware of it. There'll be some sort of ideological agenda going on for the particular stories, the way that stories are told, and it's that unpacking that we do with discourse analysis. So just a reminder that the lecture is in 2 parts. It is about preparation for assignment 2. The first part is the quantitative side of your analysis, which is the coding and the counting, the content analysis. This part that I'm going to be talking about now is the qualitative part. It's more interpretive, and that's called a discourse analysis. So a discourse analysis is really concerned with the meaning of the particular content that's in any form of text, and the meaning is in relationship to what it's saying about the social context and what it's saying also about the power relationships or the politics. It is an interpretive method that tries to make clear, to draw out the social and political context in which all texts are situated, and that is all. There is nothing innocent about any text. So this quote from Jacobs is that it allows a close scrutiny of the ways that texts are used to promote particular ideological agendas. And that's what I'm wanting you to be thinking about, what's going on politically and socially with the use of the words, the images, the way in which stories are told that you've been looking at for the first part of your assignment. And any sort of discourse is shaped by the relationships between the power and knowledge. And this is an idea from Michel Foucault, whereas though we understand that idea that those who have knowledge have power, but his other insight is that those who have power have the knowledge as well. So a discourse is a group of statements which kind of provide a language for talking about or representing a particular kind of knowledge about a topic, and it's an approach that's often associated with Michel Foucault and his interest in how discourses actually help to produce the very categories, facts and objects that they claim to describe. And his interest was particularly in how the field of medical knowledge or the field of social sciences were very powerful, and they could construct knowledge about, say, for example, criminals, or in the medical profession he was particularly interested in how madness came into being, or and different categories of madness or disorders that we might call them these days. And in his analysis, he sees that these fields of knowledge are productive. So if we're talking about if we're talking about deviance, for example, then through the knowledge of deviance, we actually create deviance as well. So he's thinking about discourse shaping our social world and shaping the way that we think about things, and as we have the knowledge, then we shape what it is that we're looking for as well, bring it into being. So in Foucault's sense, however, discourse is not just about the language that's used or the speech, but it also he's also interested in how the language works to organise fields of knowledge and practice, for example, in medicine and education. An example of that he would want to have a look and explore why it is that medical professionals, for example, might have white lab coats and wear paraphernalia like stethoscopes, and then when they sit in a room, and he'd be looking at the hierarchical relationship there between the person who has the knowledge and the power in that relationship, the medical professional, versus the person like you and I who go visit that person. He'd also be interested in things like the way in which our lecture theatres have been traditionally structured, so that the person with the most power in the room, the lecturer, is the one out the front, and everybody else is sitting obediently and usually quietly listening. So the way in which we have the knowledge and the field of knowledge will also play out in it will play out in the way that we organise knowledge as well, and how it comes into play, and it'll affect the tools that we use, and even where people sit in relationship to one another as well. So it's broader than language in terms of the way that Michel with Foucault was interested in it. So following him, therefore, there's some questions that we could ask. So how our understanding of sexuality, for example, is actually shaped by the various fields of knowledge or discourses around religion or morality, the medical field, the legal field, and the psychological. And you can see how they've all been changed over time. And a very important one to consider is that our view of sexuality when homosexuality was illegal, well, it was illegal and it was seen as abnormal. So there were two fields of knowledge affecting sexuality around that until such time as the law was changed, and some other views have changed now. The concept of deviance, for example, and mad or delinquent behaviour. Delinquent behaviour was widely used in the 1950s for young people who might just have been a bit rebellious, for example, but then how they're used in discourses like psychiatry, who might be looking for causes for delinquent behaviour, be thinking about particular disorders that people might have, in sociology, and then in criminology. And those three fields, or those three discourses, might think about deviance in quite different ways. And then you'd want to have a look at how the discourses, or these discursive constructions, are then linked to social practices, as I've said, to the practice of condemning some people to prison, for example, or seeing them as abnormal and then sending them off for treatment, which has happened to people who've identified as gay in the past, and how that's linked to various social institutions, and then to the operation of social power as well. So it's quite a complex but nonetheless very interesting field of study. So text works through a discourse analysis, drawing on Foucault. The aim of it is to kind of unpack all of those things that I've been talking about, and to dissect it, to disrupt it, and do this thing about rendering the familiar strange by interrogating. Linda Graham uses the words interrogating the discourses of true and false. Sorry, having trouble with that word. And once you do that sort of disruption, then you can change things quite materially in the social world as well. And if I go back again to that example of the power relationships with gay people, now that has been, even though we might have some people who continue to see gay people as abnormal in some way, there's been a major disruption through analysis of these discourses to the idea that it's illegal and a mental illness, for example. So another example is the idea of people with ADHD, things said within the discourses used to describe particular behaviours in school, then actually operate to speak into existence the behaviourally disordered school child, say for example with ADHD, so that becomes an object, a recognisable object, according to Judith Butler, of an object of discourse, this child who's been spoken into being fairly recently in terms of human history as somebody has a particular disorder called ADHD. So people who are interested in discourse want to understand how this condition has emerged, at which point in time, and how it's been discussed, and even how it's treated with speed, interestingly enough. And this other quote, through the process of objectification being made into objects, individuals not only come to occupy spaces in social hierarchy, but through an understanding of being put down or put in their place through the continual subjugation come to know and accept their place. And that's kind of been an important thing to think about in terms of people who come from poor backgrounds and who are placed at the bottom of the social heap. And people have asked questions about why that's not protested, arguing that through this process of treating people like objects and placing them and expecting them to stay in their place, people actually internalise that and come to accept their place at the bottom of the social heap as well. So now doing it, that's the kind of some of the background around discourse analysis and the idea of discourses. When it comes to doing it, well, it's kind of easy and hard all at the same time. And I think the best thing to do is just have a crack. And usually when students do this assignment, they do find that the familiar is suddenly rendered very, very strange indeed and very interesting. There's not one single approach to doing this at all, hence some of the confusion. You could do a Foucauldian analysis, which is very historical, and he did kind of have it limited in some ways to the medical profession and the humanities and social sciences, but you wouldn't need to do that. But he does have an historical way of wanting to understand, one of his most famous books, Discipline and Punish, wanting to understand the social and historical and legal and power relationships that brought into being this thing that we now take completely for granted, which is the prison. A critical discourse analysis. So for some of you who might have done some courses like Social Theory in Action or Politics, Policy and Citizenship, Carol Barkey has this idea of what is the problem represented to be, because if we look at the way the problem is represented, that's going to affect the policy or the particular solutions. So if I go back to that example about homosexuality, if the problem is presented as a mental disorder or as a criminal behaviour, then that will determine the way in which people are treated. However, if we treat people who are gay as just completely normal like everybody else, then they'll be treated completely normally as with everyone else. So it's about the way in which the so-called problem is being represented that will inform the solution. And then there's a field called discursive psychology, where they're trying to understand how people are thinking by listening to their conversations. So not one way of doing it. You can have a look and see what you think is the best approach. So critical discourse analysis wants to understand the way in which dominance, inequality, how people who have power abuse that power, and how that's enacted and reproduced, but also resisted in text, and having a look at that social and political context. So it's often used with dissident research, and critical discourse analysis want to make explicit what's going on in order to be able to resist social inequality. Now, the particular researcher that we have here, Van Dijk, you would have come across him earlier in the course when people were drawing on his analysis of race and racism in order to have a look at the way in which, and this is an excellent example actually of discourse analysis, the way in which stories were reported of the Port Arthur massacre. And the argument was that by saying this was the worst massacre in Australian history, revealed the racism in the community, because what was wiped out was all the massacres done against Aboriginal people in the history up until that point. So that was an example of critical discourse analysis, which was being used to expose the ongoing racism and inequality in the Australian community. Now, the effect can be change, and I think this is really exciting. There's been a lot of change. I'll just give you this as an example, you must ensure, this is a quote from writing essays here at the University of Adelaide, you must ensure that your language is inclusive. This means you must not use sexist or racist language, and instead of using mankind, you would use humanity, which is inclusive of both sexes. Now, that change has come about in very recent times, and it's come about through the sort of exposing of the inherent sexism in so much of the text that we've used historically in the West. So there was a time, for example, where it's standard to see man, the word man, standing in to mean humanity, but really, if you what feminists would argue is that really it didn't stand in for everyone, it actually stood in for man. So it kind of excluded half of the human race. And because of this critical discourse analysis, which has happened time and time again, is actually had a positive effect in now requiring people to change the way in which they also use language to be inclusive. Some people don't like that. That is what is often seen as politically correct, but lots of us are in favour of it too. And I think, and I'm one of those. I think it's a really good thing. So discursive psychology, obviously used by psychologists, so those of you who are doing psych sciences in the group might be interested in this, and this is all about trying to understand the processes of thinking. In the to and fro of conversation, people are thinking. You're thinking often very quickly. And you might not think that you're thinking because it's all, or people are thinking because it's all happening kind of silently, but the thinking is occurring and it becomes very noisy in that social activity that we call talk or chat. And this is another way in which a discourse analysis is used to try and understand how people are thinking by analysing their conversation. So you would have a conversation with people and then that would be transcribed and then you would do that sort of analysis of it. And there's some example here, or this is an example of discursive psychology if it's something that you're interested in. This was an interview with 5 people who identified as Goths and 4 who identified as pagans, and then there was analysis of their transcripts. And what the researcher argued is that there were these themes of people being an outsider and being persecuted because of their difference, but they saw being different as very good. And the identity of the group actually suggested that they saw themselves more favourably than the people in the mainstream. So, to do one of these things, you need to ask some questions of the text. There aren't any particular rules for doing it. It is about thinking about your text, trying to let go of or suspend pre-existing categories and try and examine your text with fresh eyes and ears, which can be a little bit hard. One way to do that is then to familiarise yourself, to absorb yourself in your text and try to think about what's going on there that's related to wider social, political and cultural issues. And then again, you'll do your coding, you will identify various themes that are coming up. And some of the things that you might be looking for are elements of persuasion. You might be wanting to investigate within your text how the texts are being used to persuade people. So examples of rhetoric, for example. You might be looking for incoherence or inconsistencies. You might be looking for the active presence of the invisible. So again, looking for what's not being said and really get down and focus on the details of your text. So you do need to allow some time, and you might want to think about that in the context of the particular words that you've got in your content analysis as well. And one good example that comes to mind for me, of course, is the use of asylum seekers versus boat people. So I might have gone through some articles and found both of those terms and then be thinking about the way in which boat people is used to alienate people from refugees coming to Australia, or the idea of the queue, for example, that these people are jumping the queue. Now, why are those words being used? Well, I would argue that those phrases or terms or words are being used in order to persuade the Australian people that what refugees or asylum seekers have been doing is something that is wrong and illegal, and therefore they're trying to persuade people to think antagonistically towards them. Here's an example of a discourse analysis that you can have a look at, the medicalisation of tall girls. So in this example, the researchers looked at 50 years of medical literature on the use of a particular synthetic hormone or estrogen. And so therefore, this is all very specific. They looked at 153 publications. They did have a theoretical perspective, and we're going to be talking about that in week 10. They did have a theoretical perspective where they were looking for something called linguistic repertoires. I don't do linguistics, so I don't even know what that is. But they also had this theory that medicine is a social activity, that it's done by people, with people, on people, to people. So they're looking at that. And they found in their, across these 153 publications, they really came up with kind of three themes, or what they called three linguistic repertoires. One of the institutional authority of medicine to determine that tall girls are abnormal, and that this clinical knowledge and experience then is validated through reporting risks. So not only do they create tall girls as abnormal, then they say there's a whole lot of risks, health risks, to being tall if you're a tall girl. And then they had a look at the gendered nature of the treatment and the way in which ideas about femininity, and if you think about how usually the association is that females are smaller than men and that femininity is about petiteness and tininess, etc. And so tall girls are not seen as feminine, and I'm doing all of this with quotation marks because I don't agree with it. And so there was this idea that it was the tall girls being given treatment in order to stop their growth, which was a way in which, through treatment, that whole idea of feminine equals small and petite was being reconstructed or reproduced through this therapy. In another example, this was a discourse analysis of young people's talk about suicidal subjecthood, and these were done with interviews and focus groups with 69 people. Their findings show different ways of looking at suicide. Suicide as other, how people distance themselves from suicide, express shock, didn't see it as happening in a so-called normal family. That was one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it was to see the whole idea as quite accessible, that it's not shocking at all, that we can just Google this now and see that it's a struggle for people to find meaning in their life. And the third thing that they found was this whole idea of rationalising suicide, of wanting to know why, wanting to understand it, wanting to make it all rational and entirely reasonable rather than shocking. So that's another example of discourse analysis. So the advantages of discourse analysis is that I think it does provide a very powerful tool for researchers to analyse the way in which power is organised in social settings. Who's got the power? And as Foucault was wont to say, the people who have the power have the knowledge, and those who have the knowledge have the power. So power knowledge he put together. And it provides a political critique of the ways in which some people seek to represent themselves, others, and events as powerful and normal and true. And a very important one there was the example that tall girls are abnormal, for example. The challenges are that the way in which we select text is, of course, open to bias. I don't see that as a particular problem, but for some people that is a problem. For other people, our criticism is that it kind of reduces social life to language. However, I would argue that discourses are not simply spoken, but they also become embodied and part of our landscape, as I was saying, when it comes to the authority of the medical profession and the power relations and who sits where in those conversations. And of course, there are also claims that it's unscientific. But lots of people say that about social research, and I disagree that it's unscientific, and I think it's a very useful political tool. And I've already given you just one example there of how that's being used effectively in encouraging people to use inclusive language, certainly here at the university. Thank you.